Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the MiVTTP MiTalks. We will be discussing powering progress, determining Michigan's role in emerging mobility technologies. MiTalks is a space where folks across the 11 MiVTTP communities can convene to review critical information that might be useful in the community space or in your respective ecosystems around the EV transition and all sorts of things regarding clean energy and alternative energy usage. And we love to get folks together to ask questions, and we have the opportunity to speak with folks that are experts in their fields, and we can foster discussion about what is happening in our communities. But that's where we are and that's where we're headed. So I'm going to run through our agenda briefly. Um, and I'd love for you to get going. So we are first going to do some welcome introductions as we're doing now. And then I'll do a brief overview of MiVTTP. Maybe you're new to the program and maybe you're just curious about where we are. And then we'll get going with our presentation and we'll close with our question and answer period. First, as we get through our introductions, I want to invite you to introduce yourselves to each other and to us today. So could you please use the chat to make your introductions today by please sharing your name, your affiliation or organization, and what are you hoping to gain from today's session? Maybe you already have a question or two that you want to share, which might guide our time. But either way, we'd love to know a little bit more about you this morning. So please do take a few moments to share this information, and we'll have it in the chat as well. And while you do that, I will make an introduction as well to myself and to the team. So we'll move ahead to our next slide, and I'll do a little bit of that. So MiVTTP has a deep bench of staff that are thinking about these issues and are thinking about these 11 communities as a part of the programming. I myself am Latricia Mitchell. I'm a project manager with the Economic Growth Institute and a project manager over the MiVTTP program as well. And I work and serve alongside so many wonderful people, many of whom are here today. I'll invite you to just give a wave. We have some great folks on the team, some of whom are here. We have Carmen Wells Quigg. We have Mary Ammerman, Amy Lively, and many folks that work in the wings, as well as our teammates with Michigan Clean Cities, specifically Nick Thomas, Lauren Mixon, and Jeffrey Huang. So if you have questions about the MiVTTP program and how you might want to get involved, or if there are ways that your work can intersect with the community work that we do, these are some of the faces that you would want to get in touch with. And I would love to help get you plugged in to the work that we're up to. So I'm going to move ahead just a little bit and talk with you about MiVTTP in case you're curious about the program and the overview. So MiVTTP is a program that is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. It's a 3-year program, and we exist in 3 phases. Phase 1, we took place in 2023 and 2024 as we hosted community listening sessions. Phase 2, which is strategic planning. So we supported and have supported communities across MiVTTP for strategic planning support to be thinking about the next steps in this EV transition. And we are squarely in phase 2 for many of our communities, and we're looking ahead to phase 3 for several of them as well. Overall, we serve these 11 communities across Michigan, most of which are in Southeast Michigan, as well as Lansing and Flint. So Detroit, Ecorse, Flint, Hamtramck, Lansing, Lincoln Park, Melvindale, Pontiac, River Rouge, Warren, and Wyandotte. 11 wonderful communities across the state. And overall, our goals are to understand the community needs and the impacts of this EV transition, and through that strategic planning support, provide real, tangible action plans for workforce training and technical assistance. We want to really support what communities need and show that we have heard them and demonstrate responses to these unique challenges and opportunities and promote higher job placement in MiVTTP communities. That's a little bit about us and where we are. And I want to invite you again, if you can, to make some introductions in the chat. If you could share your name, org or affiliation, and what you might be hoping to gain from today's session. We'd love to get to know you, and maybe we can do some networking in the space as well, if that would be helpful to you. So all you make your intros and continue to catch up with one another. I'll go ahead and get us ready to learn from our speaker. We have some wonderful information to be shared with us today from our speaker, Bernard Swiecki. I'll introduce him now. So Bernard Swiecki is the Vice President of Mobility and Research for the Detroit Regional Partnership, or DRP as they're often called. And DRP is a leading economic development nonprofit that serves the 11-county Detroit region. In this role, Bernard oversees the industry and research work for the Global Epicenter of Mobility, or GEM, as that's often called, as the Detroit region works to retain and expand its global mobility and automotive leadership through a world-class advanced mobility industry sector. If you have questions about GEM, this is a great time for you to ask them. Bernard leads the automotive and mobility research efforts in the support of GEM as it enables the Detroit region's existing mobility ecosystem to help folks become more connected, smarter, more inclusive, and quickly adapt to change. And in addition to spearheading this research to guide GEM's 6 regional projects, Bernard works with the entire industry supply chain from OEMs and suppliers to startups as they collectively adapt to these rapid technology and industry changes. Before joining DRP, Bernard served as the Senior Director of Research and Director of the Automotive Community Partnerships, or ACP, at the Center for Automotive Research, CAR. This is a expert in the field. Bernard has written and managed research in a diverse array of automotive fields that pertain to automaker and supplier relationships, industry electrification, and other critical issues. He's also led trade missions to China, Italy, India, and Russia. We are in for a treat this morning. That's what I know for sure. Bernard, it is a pleasure to have you with us today, and we're excited to learn and to partner with you in powering progress. So I'm going to take it up. So please take it away.
All right. Latricia, thank you very much. Just want to thank you and the whole EGI team for the invitation to speak today. Really, really appreciate it. And particularly appropriate since EGI is one of our partners on GEM, and I've got a little bit more information on that here coming up. And just here, even on this intro slide, you see our feature organizations that comprise the 6 pillars of GEM. All right, so let's get started, please. First, a little bit about GEM and what it is that we do. GEM is, as you see, a $52 million grant from the Economic Development Administration, which is a part of the Department of Commerce. And I imagine, I see a lot of familiar names on the list here for this webinar. And I imagine a lot of these folks, probably all these folks, are familiar with some of the struggles of being federal grant funded these days. But so far, so good. We're doing okay, and I think we're going to be okay through the rest of the grant, which is through the middle of 2027, essentially. But we were created, why? Why does this Detroit region need something like a GEM? First of all, GEM does have a geographic kind of boundary, a geofence around it. That is the 11 county region around Detroit. So essentially that includes everything from Flint to Ohio in terms of north-south. It does capture Ann Arbor, but not, unfortunately, Lansing. But, it is essentially, to me, very representative of the mobility industry in the state. More than half of the population of the state is in this window, and a good majority of the automaker and supplier activity as well. And so I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about, in fact, all of what we're going to be talking about today, is definitely applicable at the state level. And so, I imagine these mobility challenges that we mention here, and I won't go through them one by one, but they should be looking hopefully very familiar to everyone on this call. And, it does kind of boil down to helping the entities, the companies, the people of Michigan transition to future mobility. The thing is, what does that look like? What technologies are going to be a part of that? What does it look like in terms of moving or expanding from automotive into these other mobility sectors? And a lot of the things that we talk about are actually applicable to the overall economy itself and not just necessarily vehicles, whether they be land, sea, or air. All right, so that's why we exist. These are the pillars with Gem Central up top. That's where I work. And you'll see the rest of them with EGI getting a particular shout out here when it comes to legacy and transition. And so hopefully we are representing most of the value chain of helping companies, from startup to testing and proving to helping existing companies transition to future technologies, to helping someone find a site if they need it. And of course, the largest pillar being talent, because none of these things that we talk about happen without having the right people. And so the idea behind GEM is to be one place where, we kind of meet all these challenges and hopefully provide assistance. But what you'll see is GEM is an alignment and a focusing and informing and funding for existing entities, but GEM itself does not duplicate or compete with any of them, right? We did not want to add capacity to muddy any waters. We just wanted to assist the tremendous talent that already exists. Okay. And then a final little note here about Gem Central, which is where I work. Research, storytelling, and convening. I do run that research operation, and it's great that we now have quite a bit of information, data, statistics, and forecasts to talk about, and we're going to be getting into the meat of a lot of that stuff here in this morning's conversation. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and do that, please. Um, the main way that we distribute this information into the world at large is an online initiative. I guess you'd call it a website. I try to think of it as bigger, but this Road to 2030 website, you've got the link there and it's pretty darn easy to find. No, but the idea is that we are taking data from something we call the Future Mobility Technology Study, FMTS. You'll get all the information about that here coming up. But that was done for us by S&P Global Mobility at the end of last year. And so it addresses 7 different mobility technologies. We're going to get to those technologies, but we are on the road to 2030, introducing each one as its own distinct module. All those modules are available on that website as they come out. At this point, most of them have come out, and each module has its own webinar, and all the recordings from those webinars are also there. By the way, the next one is this coming Thursday. So if you are available 2 days from now in the morning, we'd love to see you there. So please just, either reach out to me or those links are easy to find. But we'd love to have you join that webinar as well. Plus, this site has a ton of free, cool data, information, statistics, all those modules. All right, so let's get to the substance of things. First of all, data and forecasts. Um, we're going to dive right into this stuff. First things first, let's kind of catch the big picture. And so here we've got automotive investment from automakers and suppliers combined for a 5-year period from 2020 to 2024. And what you'll see is Michigan is in the lead, which is great, but I have to say, we have not in the last few years gotten as large a share of total investment as Michigan historically has. And this is particularly true for some of the large gigafactories for batteries in particular. Um, and everything else kind of is a little bit more spread out among different product sectors. Now, in red here, you'll see this category called Other, which is to say non-electrified vehicle investment. And in blue is electrified, and you can see that blue, which is electrified, has been dominant over this time period. And 2025, I've seen the numbers, and they look very different. Partially as a result of some of these executive orders coming in from Washington, but also partially as a result of um, electric and electrified vehicles not being as popular with consumers as was forecast, let's say, 2, 3 years ago. So they are still very much a rapidly growing technology. However, just not quite as rapidly as we'd seen. And so what that has led to is a very different 2025, where that electrified to non-electrified share is just about even. And I think that's a pretty powerful reflection of the environment as it is today. Um, all right, let's move ahead, please. A few caveats about the study. I mentioned completed in September of last year. That means that the forecasts are mostly from the summer of last year. Now, already knowing that last year was an election year with an uncertain outcome, these forecasts include a bit of a hedge for some of these government programs going away. So that is baked in. Also, some of the market slowdown that has also had a negative impact on forecasts, that really started in 2023. So that is also baked in. So even though we're looking at forecasts that are more than a year old at this point, I have to say, hopefully they're quite sober and realistic, partially because of what point in time they took place, and partially because of that election hedge that had been already built into them. That being said, some of these numbers are not from that study. They are coming in from different sources, which, they have different levels of freshness, but they help keep this timely and relevant. And obviously, we're staying on track on top of all of these things and updating as necessary. Okay, so the FMTS serves as the backbone of a lot of what you're about to see. And hopefully, a lot of these reasons for why we engaged in such a study in the first place look very familiar to you, but it's essentially the nitty-gritty of when we talk about surviving this transition. Okay, what are we transitioning to and from? What are going to be the technologies, and then specifically beneath that, the products that we need to be looking at to minimize any losses, but more importantly, or just as importantly, maximize any gains from the opportunities. We want to be sort of headed to where the puck is going. It's a moving target thing constantly, and so we have to keep a close eye on that target. Okay, so I think that's a good introduction, and we're going to start hopefully quite broad. You can't start a whole lot more broad than global, and then work our way to more and more local issues and questions. Now, I mentioned a little bit more pessimism, maybe, about electrification as it goes. A few thoughts on that. One, the companies that we're talking about, yes, of course, startups are always local, right? But most of this work is being done by global automakers, global suppliers, global firms that have to have a product portfolio that kind of meets everywhere that they sell. Now, in the United States, these forecasts do call for, yes, an aggressive timeline to go electrical. We know it won't be quite as aggressive as shown here, and frankly, nor will it be quite as aggressive in Europe. For example, in Europe in 2035, the current plan is to ban the sales of non-electrified vehicles after 2035 in most sort of high volume segments. It doesn't mean an entire ban, but most high volume segments. And now there is quite a large effort to reverse that and have that take place at a point later in time. However, the electrification is proceeding quite rapidly. It is still quite global, and that means, any local slowdowns, yes, they are real, but they are happening in this global context as well. So this is a global movement, and we just have to make sure that we find which parts of this are really our sweet spots to lead. Okay, so without further ado, these are the 7 technologies that we ended up choosing for in-depth analysis in this study. By the way, we didn't choose these sort of ahead of time and then do the research. The selection was part of the research process, and so we started with something like 40-ish technologies, narrowed it down to a smaller number. We held convenings with, both the GEM pillar entities, and there are 24 of them, with local government and economic development officials, different groups. And then we narrowed it down to these 7, and then we had a final convening with automakers and suppliers as kind of a pressure check to make sure that we are, in fact, looking at the things that they find important for future growth. They validated that, then we did the research. So here's what we ended up with, five technologies that are related to propulsion and all of it electrified in some form. Two are your bread and butter battery and motor. No problem there. I think we all know that that's essential. And by the way, not just for pure battery electric vehicles, but for hybrids, plug-in hybrids, that full spectrum of products as well. Power electronics and thermal, necessary to make it all actually function. The battery and the motor get all the spotlight, but none of it, frankly, happens without those two categories. And they are becoming quite hot stuff, which is to say, well, that's a bit of a joke when we talk about thermal efficiency. But we're also talking about the fact that as the market for these products matures, having more effective, more efficient, and lighter and cheaper power electronics and thermal is becoming increasingly important because essentially what that means is you can then take those savings and get more range out of the vehicle, which means, you can either alleviate range anxiety or have the same range but have a smaller battery and reduce costs and complexity, right? So these technologies, even when they're under the surface, are all differentiators in their own regard. Hydrogen is not having a good year so far. We know this, but it's kind of a bit of a niche technology, but it does fall into one more way to drive a vehicle electrically, even though most of that juice is coming from the fuel cell and we're still using a battery, but not nearly to that same degree. It's more of a buffer than it is a power source. We do have two additional categories, software and assembly automation, which is essentially a more mature version of Industry 4.0, those kinds of technologies. And obviously very important. And then also, we'll get into this as we go into the presentation, but those final two categories, software assembly automation, they are the most broadly applicable. All of these technologies apply not just to automotive, but to all these other mobility sectors that you see here. But the farther down you go, the more I would say you have reach into not just other mobility sectors, but into other manufacturing and then into other economic sectors that have nothing to do with manufacturing. So for example, cybersecurity and AI capability, that's economy wide. Whether you're a grocery store, a bank, or an automaker, that content is meaningful and very, very impactful to you. And then, by the way, final note is we do keep track of different penetration rates and growth levels for different mobility sectors. For example, on this slide, they're over in that column on the right. There is a legend at the bottom for those of you that want to kind of get into the details of it. But you'll see, light duty, heavy, medium, and all of those good things. And one that may require some clarification is first mile, last mile. There we're talking about commercial drones. And commercial, being grouped here, but not your sort of standard kid toy drones. Those are essentially, technologies that are more toy technologies, not nearly as demand intensive as what we're talking about here. Things that are demand intensive enough to require some of the same technologies that we'd use for a full size vehicle. There's drones and then there are drones. We're talking about the latter, not the former. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're going to get into the numbers now. And these are the slides that I think we can go just a little bit faster because the actual numbers are less important than the overall trends. And so as before, we start big, we start global. Here's a look at battery demand. Going all the way back to 2016, you could see a very, very rapid rise. And then geography-wise, you also see how much of that growth has been in China. They have grown multiple times over in terms of their usage of a lot of these electrified technologies. By the way, I know much is made of China's dominance in this regard. And yes, it's true, both in terms of total production volumes, but also in terms of technology leadership, cost leadership. And by the way, we get into this in some of that content for the GEM webinar for this coming Thursday, if you are able to join us. But as much as is made of that, the leadership that China has in terms of electrification, the fact that they are now selling these vehicles at very competitive prices around the world. And so we're talking Europe, around Asia, South America, Mexico, Australia. They are making heavy inroads into all of those markets, largely on the backs of these very affordable, very capable electric vehicles. However, I did see one statistic just last week that blew my mind, which is that even if you looked at China's exports of non-electric vehicles, just the internal combustion engine powered vehicles that they have, even if you took away all the electrics and just left those conventional vehicles, China would still be the number one vehicle exporter in the world, right? So it's not just about the stuff that plugs in for those guys. It's amazing the reach that they have made. By the way, if you'd like to sample a Chinese vehicle, make some friends with the CareSoft team. They're over in Livonia. They're one of the speakers at this Thursday webinar that I've mentioned. But you can actually, if you make friends with them, they will let you drive some of their Chinese vehicles around their enormous parking lot. And it's a really interesting look at, what that looks like in that market and what we're truly up against. Point being, rapid growth, it is still happening, in spite of all these headwinds that it seems like we have had this year, and that makes these technologies still very much the hot thing to do. Next, please. Okay, we will go through a series of kind of increasingly more specific things. Here I wanted to highlight a few mobility sectors, vehicle categories that are important to Michigan. So when you look at light vehicle, medium, bus, those are all rapidly growing electrification standards. So the chart that you see here is for fully electrified vehicles. These are the segments of greatest importance to our region, and you can see, they really are taking off quite rapidly. And if we go next, please, we get into something pretty cool, which is this. Hopefully, it looks like a roadmap on how we succeed, or hopefully it may if I get into it a little bit. But here you'll see on the left the production forecast for light vehicles and battery electric vehicles. And so essentially, when you look at total vehicles, it's rarely flat. There's a little bit of growth, but it's rare. It's mostly flat, relatively so. However, when it comes to the electrified vehicles there in red, the BEVs, battery electric vehicles, you can see the rapid growth there and the very high volumes. So this is where I want to call attention to the legend on the left of each of these charts. The one on the left for BEVs goes to 12 million. The one on the right is only 2.5 million. And the one on the right deals with non-automotive vehicle production. So that's where we're talking aerospace, maritime, off-highway, agricultural, you name it. And so what you'll see is a much lower production volume to begin with. And so essentially, I think we in Michigan can treat this as a bit of a roadmap. You'll see a lot of these mobility technologies take off in automotive first. That's our bread and butter. So hopefully what happens is if we do a really good job of being a good home to those technologies here, we're set up pretty well for when they do hit higher volumes in these non-automotive sectors, right? Hopefully we're better positioned to attract and be a home for these sectors because of doing the good work when it comes to fostering the companies and the people that make these things for automotive purposes first, and then greater chance to succeed in other mobility sectors thereafter. Yeah. I did want to show you some of these growth forecasts for these other mobility sectors as well. Won't go through each one by one, but you can still see it is a pretty cool and impressive growth rate, despite the fact that the total volumes are not what they were in automotive. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, these we go through just a little bit faster, but we get more specific now. Now we're looking at Michigan battery electric vehicle production, and again, this is done toward the end of last year. So already with some of that market pessimism built into it and an election hedge built into it, but despite those factors being weighed in, you could still see a very powerful growth rate forecast for Michigan. So this is still very much a growth area for us. Let's keep going, please. And then this one we have, the full growth for these technologies on the right-hand side. We've got a little bit of a presentation migration issue, so that legend ended up on top of the chart, but hopefully you can still see what it all is, and if not, I'm happy to answer any questions on it. But what I would like to call your attention to are the growth opportunity numbers here. So this is an annual rate, not total, but for every one of these power technologies, um, you know, essentially a one-third growth rate. One note, I know fuel cells look impressive, but I mentioned earlier, they are low volume, very much low volume compared to the others, and therefore it doesn't take much of a volume swing to have a large percentage impact. So please don't be fooled by some of these dramatic numbers that we see for fuel cells. The unit numbers don't really impress nearly as much, but still, it is nice to see it in a positive direction. Couple of charts here showing the usage or the destination, kind of for light vehicle versus all of the other mobility sectors for some of these critical technologies. We give it to you for batteries and for electric motors. But as you see here, battery production, rising rapidly for all of these mobility sectors, and it's pretty cool. And this is at the US level. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see, that same thing, but this time we are looking at motors, electric motors. And a similar development, the volumes that we expect for light vehicles, so your bread and butter cars, are expected to triple. However, the volume for non-light vehicles, so everything else that floats or flies, we're talking an 8 or 9 times growth. So, total lower volumes, but the growth rates are really impressive for those other mobility sectors. Okay, so those are more of the powertrain related technologies, but then we have the others that I talked about as well. We have software, but that doesn't mean all of software. We are specifically focused on these three domains within the software category. The software-defined vehicle, cybersecurity, and over-the-air updates, or OTA. Software-defined vehicle is a technology that to a degree, you'd argue that we have vehicles that have this technology in smaller selective ways right now, but taken to its full potential, this really does give you a great degree of control and opportunity to customize the vehicle that you're driving, and make it essentially take on different personalities in a way, depending on what you're up to that particular day. Cybersecurity, one of those things that's critical if you are going to have a software designed vehicle, if you are going to do over-the-air updates, right? But it's also applicable to any part of the economy. And I think this is a theme that's going to emerge is in the past, the old plain, not goodness gracious, I'm just slamming the automotive industry here. Not to knock the automotive industry, it's been a fantastic source of economic growth in this state for over a century now. But, automotive was much more constrained in a way, I would say, to automotive or closely related mobility sectors. Now, for the first time, I would say we have this kind of broad economic outreach where in order to build and operate the vehicles that we want to, we also have to do things like cybersecurity, which make us much more competitive for a whole host of other economic sectors, be it banking, retail, medical, you name it. And so that to me is a key part of the appeal of a lot of these technologies. Let's go ahead, please. Now, within mobility, this is the breakout of software spend, which, by the way, spending is one way to look at this because, it's hard to measure software the same way that you do cars, trucks, engines, and transmissions, or motors or batteries, to put a unit volume on them. So spend is definitely one key way to do it. And here, when we look at it from the point of view of powertrain type, you'll see rapid growth in the pure battery electric, right? Hybrids are having a moment right now, no doubt about it. But a lot of this development is for future technologies. No question that as we go through time, the pure battery electrics are gradually going to be taking over, and you can see it in the anticipated spend here on software. Next, please. Okay. And by the way, we will have a nicer slide eventually here on assembly automation. But essentially, we're going to use two different slides to go through this one. One here in terms of what is involved and what it looks like as it goes through time through that 2035 forecast window. This one has both a hardware and a software element to it. Hardware everything from, robots to sensors, be they optical, laser, you name it. A whole bunch of that factory equipment that is smarter falls into that category. One heck of a lot of software to make it all happen and, very complex integration as well. But when you look at the next slide, that has some of the enabling technologies to make assembly automation happen, here we go again, right? Probably some familiar themes. The things that we need to pull it off, AI, machine learning, cloud computing, cybersecurity, all of those things, they apply to automotive, they apply to other mobility sectors, then all of manufacturing, then in many cases, economy-wide. So one more reason for the state to be really strong in this stuff because it does open doors that our previous mobility related things did not necessarily open. Okay, now time to have a little bit of fun as we head towards the end of this presentation. We get into some of the thinking. One, thoughts from me. Capacity utilization, because electrification is happening a little bit slower than anticipated. That means many of our companies are going to spend more time with one foot in each of two worlds. Maintaining a product portfolio for internal combustion vehicles and a different one for hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and fully battery electric vehicles as well, which is really challenging, particularly for some of our suppliers to maintain those two distinct product families, for an undetermined amount of time. So that's definitely a challenge that we are facing. We've touched on some of this already, some of the uncertainty. Sales and production volumes, yes, absolutely, not knowing what the overall economy is going to do. But we now have some additional wrinkles being thrown into this. A lot of these executive orders, and an uncertain trade environment that seems to be intent on, for example, restricting Chinese influence, whether that be over the US economy or globally. I know it's early days, right? It's still 2025 that we're having this conversation, but I could tell you I just saw numbers that China is on the way to having its first, I believe, $1 trillion year of exports.
Oh, wow.
So we do not seem to be harming their export activity at a global level just yet. And then a thought here about unequal impacts. OEMs and suppliers OEMs and dealers in a different bucket than our supply base would be. And, when I talk about that, what I mean is whether you start with COVID, when we had a lower supply of vehicles because for a period we stopped producing them. And then if you think about it afterward, we also had a situation where we dropped a lot of affordable vehicles from lineups. We had microchip shortages, rare earth mineral shortages. We had a whole bunch of shortages. And so even after the pandemic, we were a volume constrained industry for several years, really. Um, and it turns out the OEMs, the automakers and the dealers, came out of that just fine. Many of them, in fact, reported record profits. Partially because of just selling the expensive vehicles and staying away from the affordable. So you kind of had a family of products with larger margins, but also partially because when you have a limited amount of vehicles, you can raise the price, right? And so as an automaker, one, you didn't spend a bunch of money on incentives. Two, you got more for that vehicle. As a dealer, same thing. So even though the volumes are lower, the more expensive nature of the vehicles makes up for it. Many dealers also reported record profits during that period, from COVID all the way through the microchip shortages and then on after that. Very different story when it comes to the suppliers, right? To them, it almost doesn't matter that the ultimate buyer of that vehicle paid full sticker, or in some cases more. They get paid a piece price, and they're very, very dependent on volumes to meet the cost of the tooling for having that entire product make sense, right? And so the fact that, hey, we're selling fewer units, but at a higher price per unit does not benefit them like it does the automakers and the dealers. So we do have a supply base that is having a very different impact on it. And unfortunately, that's where most of the jobs are. That's most of the investment as well. So it is definitely something for us to keep an eye on here in Michigan. All right, moving on. So finishing off here with some questions and some thoughts that hopefully drive some discussion, right? But the Michigan stakeholder considerations, automotive leadership versus mobility leadership. So yes, we talk about because of electrification and automation, we have crossroads from automotive into these other mobility sectors that are stronger than they have ever been. However, they work both ways, right? We are the volume leaders, as you just saw in the data. That means we have a bullseye on us as the companies that make products in these other sectors try now to sell in automotive. So if we do it right, they become our market. If we do it wrong, we become a market to them, excuse me, and that makes doing this well that much more important. We talked a whole lot about how these technology changes open all these other mobility sectors to us and also other economic sectors, right? One that I did mention that I do want to is, for example, batteries. We're not getting the economies of scale, the volumes that we thought we'd get in automotive, but there is a way to still achieve volumes, achieve economies of scale, which is cell to stationary power, right? And so now the power generation, storage, and transmission does have deep automotive potential. It would not if we were just selling vehicles with standard engines and transmissions. So it is a very neat diversification economy, and we have to now think of three-dimensional chess, right, across all these different sectors as we go. And then finally, what does this mean for us, right? We in Michigan, if in fact we do fall behind in the adoption and the promotion of all these electrified products, how much does that mean that we also fall behind being state of the art in the concepts, the development, the deployment of these technologies? We are seeing more progressive, more ambitious, and I think realistic executive orders from the administration when it comes to things like microchips, AI, even some of the drone issues. So I'm not holding my breath for automotive electrification, but we shall see. But it is a decades-long process. It is more than one 4-year span. So we still have to be thinking about, will we have the policies that promote a different future going forward? Or are we going to be essentially a market where we produce and sell things that are not leading edge compared to what you see elsewhere in the world? By the way, we used to ask ourselves this question. If you go back a decade or more, and everyone went nuts about self-driving cars, right? And we were concerned about Michigan. We asked a question, like, will Silicon Valley be the place where everything gets designed and engineered and developed, where all that technology essentially is born? And then we in Michigan just make stuff that other people dreamed up, right? And so we had asked ourselves that question about California versus Michigan. Now, broader questions that we have to ask about Michigan, the rest of the world, and other economic sectors as well, right? So this is very much an expanded conversation and a fascinating one to have. Okay, so hopefully that dropped a whole bunch of concepts and thoughts into your heads. I will now be wrapping up my prepared comments here, but I did want to say thank you all very much for joining us. Looking forward to your questions, and I again want to thank the entire team from EGI for the invitation to present to you here today. And thank you again. With that, the final slide includes my contact information, but I think I'm easy to reach. I know many of you on this call. So always, for any questions, any help that we can provide, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Bernard, I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you. And yeah, what an excellent presentation. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. I do think we have some questions. Um, We already have one in the chat that I will read from Carmen, and I will encourage others to. This is a great time for you to ask your questions, and you can come off of mute to share your question with your voice, or you can type your question into the chat. But I'll first read, and I think some of that has come out through your presentation, but I'll be curious if you have anything to add or to hone in on. But where do you see Michigan having the strongest competitive advantage? I think it's kind of a follow-up to really where you just wrapped us, but I'm curious. We
Yeah, no, but I appreciate that question because that is how we need to start thinking in terms of our response. And a few things come to mind. One, the total ecosystem, uh, still unparalleled anywhere in the world. The other thing is we, in addition to being able to develop a technology, we are fantastic at taking the next step and actually producing it. And I don't just mean producing it to get it out the door, but in high volumes at a reasonable cost, getting that per unit cost down to a level that allows you to actually have a potential margin on it. So we do have the capability not just to develop it, but to actually deploy it, get it built. When you look at some of the Tesla launch problems that they had and so on, we don't generally have those issues here in Michigan. So I would say it's a combination of our technology expertise, but also just combined with how good we are at putting it into production, actually making it happen.
hmm hmm
Yeah, which by the way, Latricia, it's particularly important given that a lot of the revolutionary or sort of more step function technologies are coming from either small companies or startups, and they don't have that same expertise. If Bosch develops a technology, they know how to get it built. If a smaller company, if a startup develops a technology, they don't necessarily have that experience. And I feel like that makes Michigan more attractive.
Yeah, right on. Super. Thank you. All right, I have some more questions that I have developed, but I'm curious, of course, if you have questions. I know this presentation was pretty comprehensive, but I have my next question is, I'm always thinking about folks in and out of this space. So I'm curious how stakeholders outside of the automotive industry, folks like local government officials, educational institutions, even economic development professionals or regional leaders, how can they support these intersections of existing and emerging technologies to advance the region's leadership?
Yeah, we could have a few webinars on that.
Yeah.
Um, no, so I would say, a few things. One, given the impact of some of these executive orders and tariffs and so on,
Mhm.
we need to make sure that we're getting our visibility in Washington. And that does not just mean the White House, it also means congressional and regulatory visibility. I was really struck at an aerospace conference that I attended a couple of months ago how big that lobbying effort was perceived to be, and how much they were looking at which industry is best represented. So I would say, one, try to come together on a unified voice that takes this message, obviously to local elected leadership, but at this point, most importantly, to Washington. We are
Mm,
also seeing the cancellation of a lot of federal grants that were driving innovation in this space. So I would say, there's potentially a greater role to be played by, whether it's foundations or other entities that can provide the funding for some of this to happen,
mhm,
because we are losing some places that were previous drivers of innovation. And then I would say also greater integration into one ecosystem. When we
mm,
put GEM together, it's amazing. 24 entities in the greater Detroit area. But at that first kickoff meeting, it was really fascinating to see how many of them said, I had never heard of this entity. Or I had heard of them, but I didn't know what they do. They will
yeah.
be an asset, right? So
Mhm.
right in each other's backyards. It turns out we may know of each other, but we're not using the full breadth of assets that we have available to us. So that kind of
Mm.
alignment, I think, is going to be critical to pulling this off.
And I think what I'm hearing you say, what you said so excellently, is to be honest, I don't know if we will make it through the next window without more collaboration, without more mutuality and finding ways to support each other. I mean, the work that Jem is doing is so important. And we're trying to do similar work of convening on the community side here in my VTIP. But that seems critical. And I appreciate you highlighting and uplifting, honestly, political advocacy and civic advocacy and engagement. And I think there are all sorts of ways that perhaps we, even the folks that are here on this call, could foster collaboration in new and fresh ways. Yeah, and hopefully we can tamp down some of that scarcity and really find ways to support each other because, yeah, you're right that the some of the wells do seem to be running dry in this season, and yet there have to be creative ways that we can move through it. That is really, really valuable. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to take like our last few minutes here, just in case anyone has any comments or questions, or if you'd like to come off mute to ask Bernard anything. It could even just be an aside or just a little bit of a networking moment before we transition. Mm. So I'll be silent for about 10 good seconds, and then I'll move us ahead if you don't have any questions. All right. That is just fine. So coming up next for us in my VTIP and for my talks, you can look ahead. We have some things planned in January, our next webinar, and we really want to emphasize as well for you that the road to 2030 is a resource that's available to you as my VTIP stakeholders. And Bernard mentioned several resources throughout the presentation. So if you have follow-up questions, please do feel free to reach out to him or to us if you'd like to see or learn more about what's available. And of course, they do also have a webinar coming up this Thursday, just 2 days from now. So make sure that you check that out as well. Um, on the horizon. We have some discussions planned and some great experts that are ready to talk a little bit about the workforce development needs happening in the EV space, maybe some career pathways discussions coming out, as well as some battery technology information. I see a note here from Tracy from Cleanfields, Michigan. Speaking of political and civic engagement, yeah, urge your senator to fix the EV registration fees by supporting S593. So please do check this out. And we might also, if you don't, if you're open to this, Tracy, we might also include it in our MiTalks or MiVTTP newsletter as well after some review. I think it would be great to share this out to further communities so that we can see what's up. Is that all right? Okay, wonderful. Well, all in all, everyone, thank you so much for your participation. We are so glad to have you here, and we really appreciate your engagement in this initiative. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you again, Bernard, for all that you shared. So excellent.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.